Today we have an awesome guest. He's a web designer and developer. You may know him from his CSS newsletter, Piccalilli, his awesome 11D starter theme, Hylia, his friendly browser checker, mybrowser.fyi, or just his amazing hot takes on Twitter. Let's go ahead and welcome to the show, Andy Bell. Andy, how's it going today?
Hey, how you doing? You okay? Thanks for having me on.
Pretty good. So that was my introduction of you, but how would you describe yourself? Are you a designer or a developer in your own mind?
I think I'm a hybrid of them both. So I tend to call myself a web designer these days, because I think that even though it's a pretty old school term, it sort of describes what I do perfectly. I tend to see projects start to finish. So yeah, web designer or front end developer tends to be what I do most of the time these days.
Cool. So what do you actually do for work and for fun?
And then I don't get any chance to have fun because I've got 2 young kids. So yeah, fun is whatever includes those two. But yeah, I remember fun from before that. I
got you. I'm the same way. I got a 3.5-year-old. There's not a lot of fun outside of him. So
I feel for you there.
All right. So what was kind of your entry point into this whole like JAMstack philosophy and skill or static sites or whatever you like to call it?
So I think I started with static sites with Jekyll a few years ago. I got into Jekyll. I picked up it as a solution for a really ropey agency project that was super fluid. The brief was so thin you could smoke it, and I just knew that it was going to be a nightmare from the start. So I sort of suggested, well, why don't we use Jekyll to build it, because if and when things change, it'll be a much easier process. So that got me really into it. Then I started using it for like my personal blog and all that. But it was when 11T came around where I really started getting into static site stuff properly, like really heavily into it, because it's just such a flexible system. And ever since then, I literally use it for everything now. So yeah, it's brilliant. Love it.
Very cool. So as a professional freelancer, you're using it on like your client projects and stuff like that?
So at the moment, if you're to list the things that 11T currently does for me, I use it for prototyping, visual design. It's powering a book, it's powering a newsletter, and it's powering normal client websites, my website. Literally everything is now running through 11T in some way or some form at the moment.
So would it be safe to say that kind of 11D is kind of your jam in the JAMstack?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Okay. Massive, big, thick wad of 11T jam, yeah.
Is there any other technologies or products that you're utilizing in the JAMstack right now?
Yeah, so I do a lot of stuff with Node when I do anything that's got like remotely backend. So I tend to there's a project that called Every Layout that I work on with Hayden Pickering. That's all built with 11T, but we use Heroku and Node to do the sort of clever stuff, which is all going to be, well, by the time this goes out, it actually all will be live. And so I tend to use that, but I am slowly getting into the serverless stuff as well, and the cloud functions, because like Netlify made that really easy. So yeah, but really I tend to stick around in static site world. Yeah, that's essentially where I hang out.
Cool. So what actually made you fall in love with the JAMstack? Like you talked about, Jekyll being your entry point. Obviously now with the 11D, it's making it much more, I guess, probably fun to work with.
Yeah, sure.
But what kind of where did you fall in love with some of the ideas?
Oh, I think it was it's the empowerment thing. So I'm pretty weak with back-end technology. It took me a long time to appreciate that, and you can achieve a lot as a sort of designer with the JAMstack. A lot of power is given to you, and you can do a lot for nothing as well. And that's one thing I really appreciate about it, is that someone can get a 11T site or whatever they want to use and deploy it for free on Netlify, and then they own their own content. So that's just really appealing, and I think it's going to be really key in the sort of success of JAMstack as well.
I'm kind of curious because I'm a hybrid too. Like I'm a designer developer, and I hate the back end. I hate dealing with servers and all that. But I've been doing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for like a decade. How would you talk to a designer that's maybe getting into HTML and CSS about static sites and about that empowerment that you were saying?
Interesting question. So if someone's like just getting into HTML and CSS, I wouldn't introduce them to JAMstack, because I think it could create some confusion really early, especially when you're understanding. Because I think when you're learning HTML, it's useful to be able to see the document as a whole. I think it's something that makes me a bit uncomfortable about the JavaScript frameworks as well, is that there's a high level of abstraction that I think causes a lot of confusion for beginners. So, but once they were a bit more comfortable and understood HTML, I'd probably introduce them to Eleventy and Nunjucks and say, look, this is now, you can now take this piece of code that you've written and create a partial, and then, you know, introduce it like that, piece by piece, so keeping it as simple as possible. And that's one thing that's really good about especially Eleventy, is that it lets you go from 0 to 0.1. You know, you don't have to go all in and fully commit to it like Gatsby or something like that. You can gradually implement it on an existing setup, so you can actually teach it by doing things slowly but surely, and so people can understand what its role is and where it lives in the stack.
Yeah, you mentioned Gatsby. I actually just saw a presentation on Gatsby, and just it kind of solidified my personal opinions. It looks, you know, super powerful and all that, and I've played with it, but the complete abstraction of everything that's going on, I looked at it and I just said, I've been doing this a long time. My brain doesn't work like that. I can't imagine anyone else getting into it.
Yeah. No, I did. I did a client project with it earlier in the year, and just found myself yearning back for Eleventy. It was a bit too much, a bit too difficult to do web development. So I thought this doesn't really have a role in my stack, especially. So yeah, stick with I think what Eleventy gives you, I don't think you really need it, to be honest. But you know, that's just my opinion, I suppose.
Sure. And I guess beyond that, you know, talking about you know, newbies, or, you know, people who are maybe making that advancement from being able to just do that static HTML, CSS, and maybe a little JavaScript into more, you know, full stack. I'm putting air quotes, and no one can hear those radio, air quotes, but yeah. More kind of full stack development. Mm-hmm. Would you still talk to them about more traditional stuff, or are you all in static sites, JAMstack ideology? So
progressive enhancement is my thing. So whatever you use, as long as what gets delivered to the front end is HTML, functional HTML by default. So if nothing else arrives down the pipe, you've still got a usable website that's acceptable and accessible, then it's all good. And you could use whatever you want to do that. You can use PHP, you can use Node. I don't really care, as long as what arrives, if the only thing that arrives is the HTML, it works and you can use it. And then everything else on top of that is a bonus. So CSS, great, that works and that looks good, you know. And then JavaScript, definitely a sort of an additional sprinkling of functionality rather than the whole thing, you know. So that's how I always operate, regardless of what the project is, really. Even when I've built like React projects, it's been SSR to make sure that if the client bundle fails, which it will, there's not a sort of might about it. There's a will about it, and to make sure that it still works without all this stuff. So yeah, definitely.
Do you think that the static sites lend themselves stronger to progressive enhancement, or is it just a matter of methodology?
I think they make giving that core base point a lot easier, and I think that's probably one thing I really like about them. Being able to generate what I want, which is that HTML output, seems to be really easy, and I think it's almost easier to generate, well, for me especially, to do that with a static site generator rather than WordPress now, which, you know, was what I cut my teeth with. WordPress, I think even now, if I was to take on a air quotes simple project, before I might sling out a WordPress theme, whereas now I'll sling out an Eleventy site because I think that's now the quickest way to do it for me. Yeah.
That's actually really, really interesting. So I used to work in an agency for about 6 years, and we had our own custom content management system and all sorts of stuff. But anytime a client couldn't use that, we would just sling a WordPress theme out there. So you think that potentially we're getting to the point where it would just be easier to do a quick static site instead of picking out a moderate to decent theme and plugging and playing?
I think so. I think one thing that is missing, I know there's a couple of marketplaces for themes. I was just introduced to this thing called Stackbit the other day as well, which I thought was really cool, which has that whole methodology going about it, and I think that is going to be the breaking point and the bit that pushes static sites over, because like people start with themes a lot in WordPress world especially, and I know Gatsby started doing it themselves as well, and I think that's going to be the key, and I really hope something arrives for other generators like Eleventy, Hugo and stuff. I know there's Jekyll themes stuff that's still going these days as well, so I think that might be the thing that helps people, at least starter kits anyway, that do that initial setup for people, because it can be a daunting, Eleventy starts with nothing. There's nothing in there, it's empty. So I think people, I know Phil Hawksworth, he's created a really nice starter kit, and then obviously I created the Hylia or Hylia, whatever you want to call it, kit as well, and it's just stuff like that, like these little starting points that get people into it, and I think that will enable people to like create these projects quickly and efficiently.
Now, I mentioned Hylia or Hylia. You also, I think I read somewhere that you have a starter kit that's like a blank starter kit for Eleventy.
Hebra, or however you pronounce it, depending on your accent. Yeah, that is. I don't even remember it. You might remember it from the WordPress old days, where there's a thing called Starkers by Elliot J. Stocks, and it's basically that, but Eleventy. Like that's how I got into WordPress. Was I watched Chris Coyer's digging into WordPress screencasts, and one of the first things I recommended was to use his Starkers theme. So I got really into that, and I always found it really useful because it just gave me HTML and nothing else. And I thought, well, might as well. That when I released Hylia, and it went down really well with everyone, and I thought it'd be nice to also give people the HTML only version of it as well, if they don't want to use all the Sass and all that stuff that I've added in there. So yeah, it seems to be it's not obviously nowhere near as popular as the other one, but it seems to be helping some people out, which is good.
Well, that was you said the Stacker was kind of your intro into like WordPress theming. That one wasn't mine, but it was a similar idea, right? Like where there wasn't. I just got like the loops and stuff like that, and then I could edit that sort of thing instead of having to write from scratch. Exactly,
and that was it. Because one thing I didn't like about WordPress themes as like in design was that it had this sort of prescriptive setup, and undoing that was really difficult. So being able to put actual CSS on that you'd authored yourself was a big selling point for me.
Do you think there's any room for looking at like static HTML themes? Do you think that's going to be something that can fill that gap for static sites, or is it just too much effort at that point even to convert it over?
It could do, yeah. I think one thing our industry is lacking big time on is knowledge of HTML, especially, and CSS, but mainly HTML. There's always been, I wrote a post about it the other day about on Monday, where there's this theory that a button that's been created with like React Native or whatever it is more accessible. And it might be technically correct, but at the same time, there's a lot of caveats to that statement. And I think one thing that's problem, I see a lot of documentation, a lot of popular websites and code samples are using very poor markup. So there's definitely a space for, I'd say, lazy developers who don't want to learn markup, because it is the founding, is the core thing on a website is HTML. You can't have a website without HTML. I think there's space for someone to just do it for them, to put out an accessibility fire, as I like to call it, just reduce one more opportunity for someone to have a miserable experience with assistive technology is to give people that base point, the correct markup for an article, the correct markup for a post list, or even for like an e-commerce, something like that. I definitely see space for that.
So I don't want to take up a huge amount of your time, so I'll move into the last couple things. First and foremost, what's your like actual jam right now? Like, what are you listening to? What's your favorite song or artist that you've got going on?
I was looking in Spotify before we started, and there's this artist called, I'm going to murder the name, but Leah Letemps. I'll send you a link, put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's really funky. It's been on constant loop for me recently, and while I've been working, and I've been doing a lot of design work recently, so it's really sort of suited to that. I need music that puts me in a good mood when I do design. Otherwise, I do terrible work. So it doesn't really matter when I do development. I can listen to whatever, but design is a very specific theme that I need. And so I'll send a link to the album that I've been listening to a lot. But it's great. It's really cool.
And then you have you've got a lot of things I'm sure you can promote. What do you want to promote on the podcast today?
I think because it's, especially when this goes out, me and Hayden have created this thing called Every Layout, and it's something that's really important to both of us. We're both really into CSS. As you mentioned, I run a newsletter about CSS called Piccalilli, which incidentally is getting re-platformed on the JAMstack as we speak. But Every Layout we're trying to distill CSS layouts and simplify them, and teach people to simplify CSS as well. I think we, as an industry, we've overcomplicated CSS, and we throw far too many heavy frameworks and heavy tools at what are actually simple layout problems. And I think there's a sort of a stigma about the modern layout tooling, such as Flexbox, that Hayden and I are trying to sort of break and teach people how to use them. And it seems to be going down quite well. So that'll be ready for purchase when this goes out. So go and buy it, because when you buy it, it means that we can give it for free to people that need it for free. And that's the whole mantra that we're doing with it, is that we're using people's purchase licenses to then subsidize people who really need it for free and being able to give it to them. So
that's amazing. And the stuff I've read online that's in there is also amazing stuff too. Yeah. So you should definitely go every.layout.
Every-layout.dev is the URL.
And that'll be in the show notes too. But
cool.
Yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. It's I love we could do a whole episode about have you and Hayden on later on. But it's amazing stuff.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today, and
no worries. It's been good fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and we'll go from here. I want to thank Andy Bell one more time for being the inaugural guest on what I hope to be a long-running podcast dedicated to showing the best of the JAMstack world. I also want to thank you, dear listener, for listening through the end of the podcast and being sure to go into your podcatcher of choice, whether that be iTunes, the Google Play Store, or some third party that I'm not even familiar with, and hitting that like button and leaving us a positive review to let everyone know that this is one of the better podcasts to listen to for the JAMstack. So until next time, keep making amazing things on the web and keep things jammy.